And I'm Jeff.
So last week we talked about physical infidelity. So if you missed it, click the link above or check it out after. This week, though, we're going to be talking about the triggers of emotional and physical infidelity.
Yeah, and before we get started, let's pray. Father, in the mighty name of Jesus, today we give you honor, give you praise, we give you glory. Father, we thank you, Lord God, for this time, Lord, we're recording this session here. Father, we pray that this video, Father, will go out and bless the hearts of every person watching this video, Father, in the mighty name of Jesus. Pray that you will pour out into us, Heavenly Father, wisdom, Heavenly Father, wisdom for marriage, Heavenly Father, Lord, and for strengthening marriages, Heavenly Father, repairing, restoring intimacy, Lord God. That those who hear this video and see it, Father, and view it, Lord God, that their marriages will be made well in the mighty name of Jesus, Father. We will increase the strengthening the understanding of marriage, Heavenly Father, what's required, Lord, to make it thrive, Father, Lord. That we just thank you and give you honor, Father. Take complete control of the session, Lord, in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. So, as a quick review, we want to go over what emotional and physical infidelity are. So, emotional infidelity is when you are confiding in someone other than your spouse about your deepest vulnerability and most intimate thoughts.
Yeah. And physical infidelity is any form of physical touch that is meant to express intimacy with someone outside of your marriage.
Right. So, let's get into these triggers.
Well, there are two kinds of triggers. The one that leads to infidelity.
Right, and that means that it's the one that causes a spouse to desire comfort outside of their marriage.
Yeah, and the other one occurs after the infidelity has happened, right?
Right.
And this would be in regards to the spouse who was betrayed.
Right, and so today we're going to be focusing on the triggers that lead to the infidelity. And the reason we're speaking about these particular triggers is because this is a way to avoid infidelity and protect your marriage as a whole. It's also the way to repair a marriage that's been broken by infidelity.
Yeah, you have to get to the root of the problem in order to fix it, right? So one reason or thing that triggers infidelity is when a spouse feels like the relationship is one-sided. Or if by one-sided I mean one spouse feels underappreciated, undervalued, or if they feel if another spouse feels some kind of financial pressure from another, or they may feel like the spouse is not putting as much effort as they should in the marriage in general.
Right, and because of that feeling of like bearing the weight of the whole marriage, this spouse may look for a way to release that pressure, or find someone that is willing to bear the weight with them since they feel as though their spouse won't. Yeah,
more simply, if a spouse feels like it's like he or she is not getting enough attention from you, they may look for it elsewhere.
Right, and the spouse that decides to step out of their marriage, of course, is responsible for their actions. But like I said before, the point of us addressing these triggers is to avoid infidelity from becoming a part of your marriage. Or it's to begin the healing process of your marriage so that we can get to the root of the problem. So please keep that in mind as we're discussing all the different triggers for infidelity. So the next one would be lack of communication.
Yes. Communication is one of the foundational pieces of every marriage.
Right. And this is why lack of communication is one of the triggers for infidelity. So many couples think that when they're discussing things like their schedule, their day, their plans, that they're actually communicating with their spouse. But that's more of like a superficial type of communication. When we say communication within marriage, we're talking about confiding in your spouse with deep, intimate conversations, talking about your concerns, talking about your passions, your motivations, sharing your moments of discouragement, sharing your moments of excitement, everything.
Yeah, they're your best friend.
Right, and that's exactly where I was going with that. You tell them things that you wouldn't even dare, to tell someone else. Something that may even be embarrassing. You're willing to share that with them because that's the type of relationship that you formed. And then, of course, there's the flip side to that, right? Then that spouse, or your spouse, let's say, should be able to do the same thing with you. If your spouse isn't able to share their intimate thoughts with you, because you're disregarding them, because you're shutting them down, because you're rejecting them, or maybe you're just brushing it off and not acknowledging them, they will look for someone who is willing to listen.
Yeah, and this one is particularly for the men. So we discussed last time in a previous session something that I called a communication impediment, right, for men, right? So fellas, you've got to learn not only to express your most intimate and vulnerable thoughts with your wife, you also need to be willing to listen to hers.
Yes, and this becomes especially important in moments of disagreement.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you both need to be able to express your concerns in a judgment-free way, you know, and also be able to trust that you're being genuinely heard by your spouse.
Yeah, for sure. Because the inability to be able to express those concerns may lead to that same spouse sharing those concerns with someone outside of your marriage or a person they find easier to express those concerns to.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
If your spouse feels as though you aren't listening to them,
Mm-hmm.
or your spouse feels as though they're unable to express or communicate how they feel to you, either frustration would cause them to possibly go into emotional or sexual infidelity.
Yeah, so I think the next two are pretty similar.
Mm-hmm.
So we can probably group those into under sex life concerns.
Yeah.
The first concern being that one spouse is unsatisfied with their sex life, or a satisfied spouse. If that's the case, then a satisfied spouse is less likely to cheat.
Right. And so we're going to back those up with numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I like statistics and studies. So there was a study that showed that 52% of people who were unsatisfied with their sex lives would be tempted to physically engage with someone they were attracted to, compared to only 17% of those who actually were sexually satisfied. So in other words, that means that a spouse is 3 times more likely to cheat if they're unsatisfied with their sex life. That is a lot, right?
Yeah.
Then there was another study that showed that 70% of men and 50% of women who cheated was because of sexual boredom.
Yeah.
That's a majority, and it also clearly points to the fact that this is really big for men.
Yeah, and now it will require a couple to be willing to discuss sex openly.
Yeah.
So men, don't get offended if your wife is trying to tell you that there are things that she may not like or other things that she may prefer. And honestly, if you are making sure that your wife is enjoying sex as much as you are, you'll know when she's unsatisfied.
Yep. And the same goes for women. You know, don't be offended if your husband wants to try new things, new positions, or maybe even have sex in a new place.
Yeah.
You know, have fun with sex. Don't be afraid to initiate a new position that you think maybe you'll like more or maybe he'll like more.
And there are also a lot of resources to improve your sex life if you aren't satisfied. Now, of course, when you're saying that, be careful,
right.
Especially with the internet, because you know these kinds of sites, although they can be helpful, sometimes they can be linked to other sites that will lead you down a rabbit hole to other sites you know what I'm talking about. Sites you know you're not supposed to be looking at, and you know, so just be careful with that for sure.
Yeah. And you know, you can even make this exciting.
Yeah.
Where, you know, both of you get to try one new position or one new thing you discovered each time you have sex.
Yeah, so the other concern under the category of sex life is that one spouse's sex drive is significantly higher than the others. All right? And this doesn't just apply to men, it also applies to women.
Yes. There's a very simple solution for this one.
Yes.
You could just have a discussion about how often you'd both like to have sex. You know, is it 2 times a week? Is it 3 times a week? 4 times?
Yeah.
Every day? Several times a day? You know, you're not gonna know unless you ask. And we definitely have had this conversation ourselves.
Yes. By having this discussion, you are both able to see that the sex drive you're both able to see the sex drive of your spouse, and perhaps how much more of a difference there is between you two, basically, when it comes to that.
And you know, if the disparity is great, then just come to a compromise. You know, you see, without being candid and blunt about this type of conversation, it's easy for a spouse to feel unfulfilled with their current sex life, and that their spouse wouldn't even know it because you never had the discussion to begin with. And the spouse that's unsatisfied may even initially try to initiate with their spouse more often. And the other spouse is probably thinking like, yo, this is a bit much. Like, we just had sex yesterday. Can you too? We just had sex a couple hours ago. Can you too? But, you know, and so the spouse that's initiating may feel rejected. And with that rejection, you know, eventually they're not going to want to initiate anymore, and it's very possible then that when their spouse does initiate, they're going to reject their spouse because they're no longer interested.
Yeah, this is definitely avoidable by just having a simple conversation.
Yep.
And there's no shame in the number of times you desire to have sex.
Right? I mean, God created it. Hello.
Yeah.
You're supposed to want to have sex with your spouse and enjoy it as much as you want.
Yep.
So, another trigger that we're going to talk about that could lead to infidelity is growing apart because of the busyness of life.
Yeah, and it's so easy to get caught up in the house, right? Cars, careers, businesses, children, and other family members. Just life as a whole.
Right, the American dream.
Yeah.
Right. And that's exactly why you have to be intentional about making sure that this does not happen, okay? And I'll use children as an example because this is actually a very common trigger for infidelity. So, when couples first have their newborn requires a lot of attention, right? There's lots of doctor's appointments, there's making sure the child is developing physically, they're developing intellectually, are they the right weight, are they getting enough food, all these things, all of this responsibility is generally tiring. I'm sure most parents would agree with that. I mean, if you don't, please, tell us what your secret is, because we would love to know.
That would be great.
Yes, please. But, at some point, someone is going to desire to have sex. Someone is going to desire to just have that time between the two of you again. And this moment is so important. It's a pivotal moment because it tends to determine how the trend is going to be for the rest of the marriage.
Yep.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
Now, granted, there are situations in which a woman may not physically be ready to have sex again. And husbands, you just really need to be understanding and patient about that. But in general, you should really try your best to make sure that when this moment happens, that you find a way to satisfy that desire of your spouse, or that time that they just want to spend together with the two of you. It doesn't have to be right at the moment.
Yeah.
You can even be like, okay, well, let's schedule this for later,
Yeah. Just plan a day or weekend trip with just the two of you.
Yeah.
All right. If you have to remember that your children will grow up and have their own household. So don't allow them to be the reason that you two grow apart from each other.
Yeah, I hope y'all heard that.
Yeah.
Your children will leave.
Yes, they will.
And then it'll just be you and your spouse. So the same thing applies, to houses, to cars, to money, to all of it. These may be a priority for you, but it should never be prioritized above your marriage.
Yeah. Because
ultimately, you'll end up losing it.
Yeah, and what would have been the point of building all of this only to have it lost or be basically jeopardized?
Right, and no one to share it with.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So another trigger that kind of ties into this one, especially for women, and it's in regards to having children. Women tend to feel a bit more insecure about their bodies because so many changes have happened. So they may not have that desire to have sex or to be intimate because of all of those changes in their body.
Yeah, I mean, this is why it's so important as a husband to make sure that your wife feels wanted and beautiful.
Yeah.
I love telling my wife that she's absolutely gorgeous, just absolutely stunning. In times when she doesn't expect it, right? It's very satisfying, her response.
Yes, but this also applies to men. As men get older and just maybe busier, perhaps their bodies aren't as chiseled. But you want to make sure that your husband knows that you still think he is fine. Okay. Hey.
Yes, and this trigger actually also ties into another category, another area, which would actually be pornography.
Right.
But you have to tune in next week for more.
Yeah, it's a big topic, so we want to make sure that we spend time to properly address it.
But we hope you enjoyed this session and that you'll tune in next week for more.
Yeah, please like, share, comment, all of that jazz. We'd love to hear from you. We want to know what you thought.
Yeah, definitely. Please follow us on Instagram at heavenonearth_marriages.
So, Until next time, we love you.
And remember,
Your marriage can be like heaven on earth.